Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most bizarre chapters in human history. We're talking about the Roman Empire, the most powerful civilization the world had ever seen. Ruled by men who commanded legions, controlled vast territories, and were worshipped as living gods. And yet, despite all that power, despite all that glory, many of these emperors died in ways so dumb, so completely avoidable, that you'll wonder how they managed to conquer anything in the first place. Before we begin this journey through imperial incompetence, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your support helps us keep bringing you these fascinating stories from history. Now, settle in and prepare to hear about 15 of the absolute dumbest deaths in Roman imperial history. These are the rulers of the known world, and they died from mushrooms, toilet assassinations, and yelling too hard. Let's begin. We start our countdown with a death that's become almost legendary for its sheer irony. This is the story of Emperor Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 AD and who died from eating his favorite food, mushrooms. Now you might think, well, accidental poisoning from mushrooms happens. That's unfortunate, but not particularly dumb. But here's the thing. Claudius wasn't accidentally poisoned. He was deliberately murdered by his own wife, Agrippina, and everyone, absolutely everyone, knew that mushrooms were her weapon of choice. She was famous for it. And he ate them anyway. Let me give you some context. Claudius was not supposed to be emperor. He had a stutter. He limped. And the rest of his family considered him an embarrassment. When Caligula was assassinated, the Praetorian Guard found Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, terrified he'd be killed next. Instead, they made him emperor, almost as a joke. But Claudius turned out to be surprisingly competent. He conquered Britain, built aqueducts, reformed the legal system, and generally did a decent job of running the empire. His big mistake was marrying Agrippina the Younger, his own niece, which was scandalous even by Roman standards. Agrippina was ambitious, ruthless, and had a son from a previous marriage named Nero. She wanted Nero to be emperor, but Claudius had his own son, Britannicus, who was the rightful heir. Agrippina needed Claudius out of the way, and she needed it to happen before Britannicus came of age. So she served him poisoned mushrooms at a feast. The ancient historian Tacitus tells us that Claudius loved mushrooms, called them the food of the gods. Agrippina knew this. She had the palace's famous mushroom chef, a man named Helotus, prepare a special dish. Claudius ate it enthusiastically. Within hours, he was violently ill. When he started to recover, Agrippina panicked and had his doctor, a man named Xenophon, finish the job by shoving a poisoned feather down his throat, supposedly to help him vomit, but actually to deliver a second dose of poison. Claudius died that night. He was 63 years old. The man who conquered Britain, who built the Claudian aqueduct, who reformed Roman law, was killed by mushrooms prepared by his own wife in his own palace, using a method she was literally famous for. And he never saw it coming. That's our first entry in the dumbest imperial deaths, and we're just getting started. Our next death is so undignified, so completely lacking in imperial majesty, that it's almost hard to believe it's real. This is the story of Elagabalus, who ruled from 218 to 222 AD, and who was murdered on a toilet and then thrown into a sewer. He was 18 years old. Elagabalus is one of the most controversial emperors in Roman history. He became emperor at age 14 through the scheming of his grandmother, Julia Maesa, who claimed he was the illegitimate son of the popular emperor Caracalla. Once in power, Elagabalus proceeded to offend absolutely everyone in Rome. He was a priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, and he tried to make this foreign god supreme over Jupiter, which outraged the traditionalists. He reportedly married and divorced 5 times in 4 years, including marrying a Vestal virgin, which was sacrilege. Ancient sources claim he appeared in public wearing makeup and women's clothing and offered enormous rewards to any physician who could give him female anatomy. Whether all of these accounts are true or exaggerated by hostile historians, we'll never know. What we do know is that by 222 AD, everyone had had enough. The Praetorian Guard, the Senate, and even his own grandmother decided he needed to go. They planned to replace him with his cousin, Alexander Severus. On March 11, 222 AD, the Praetorian Guard mutinied. Elagabalus and his mother tried to flee but were trapped in the palace. According to the historian Cassius Dio, Elagabalus ran to the latrines, the palace toilets, to hide. The guards found him there and killed him. Then, and this is the part that really adds insult to injury, they killed his mother, mutilated both bodies, dragged them through the streets of Rome, and threw them into the Tiber River through a sewer outlet. The Emperor of Rome, the most powerful person in the known world, was murdered while hiding in a bathroom and then disposed of like sewage. His reign lasted 3 years, 10 months, and 12 days. He never made it to 19. Whatever you think about his personal life or religious reforms, you have to admit that's a spectacularly undignified way to go. Now we move to Emperor Caracalla, who ruled from 198 to 217 AD, and whose death proves that even the most paranoid, violent emperor can be caught in the most vulnerable moment possible. Caracalla was murdered in 217 AD while urinating on the side of a road during a military campaign. Yes, you heard that right. The Emperor of Rome was killed while taking a piss. Caracalla was not a nice man. He's most famous for murdering his younger brother Geta in their mother's arms, then launching a campaign of terror that killed thousands of Geta's supporters. He was brutal, paranoid, and spent most of his reign on military campaigns, personally leading his troops and living in military camps, rather than in Rome. The soldiers loved him because he raised their pay and lived like one of them. Everyone else was terrified of him. In April 217 AD, Caracalla was traveling between Edessa and Carrhae in modern-day Turkey, leading a campaign against the Parthian Empire. His entourage stopped for a rest, and Caracalla, needing to relieve himself, walked a short distance from the road for some privacy. His bodyguards stayed back to give him space. This was the moment his Praetorian prefect, a man named Macrinus, had been waiting for. Macrinus had learned that Caracalla planned to have him executed. Desperate, he had convinced one of Caracalla's bodyguards, a soldier named Martialis, to kill the emperor. Martialis had his own grudge. Caracalla had recently denied his request for a promotion. So when Caracalla walked away from the group to urinate, Martialis followed him and stabbed him to death. The Emperor of Rome, a man who had conquered kingdoms and murdered thousands, was killed while peeing on the roadside by a disgruntled soldier who'd been denied a promotion. Caracalla was 29 years old. He'd ruled for 6 years, and his last moments on earth were spent with his pants down on a dusty road in Syria. Macrinus immediately declared himself emperor, though he only lasted a year before being overthrown himself. But that's another story. Our next death involves Emperor Commodus, who ruled from 177 to 192 AD, and who was strangled to death in his bath by a professional wrestler named Narcissus. This death is dumb for several reasons, but mainly because Commodus saw himself as the greatest gladiator who ever lived, and was killed by an athlete in the one place he should have been safe, his own bathroom. Commodus is famous to modern audiences from the movie Gladiator, where he's played as the villain. The real Commodus was somehow even worse than the movie version. He was the son of the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and everyone expected him to be a wise and just ruler. Instead, he became obsessed with gladiatorial combat. He fought in the arena himself, hundreds of times, always winning because, well, he was the emperor, and no one dared beat him. He killed animals, fought gladiators who were ordered not to defend themselves too hard, and generally made a mockery of the games. He renamed Rome after himself. He renamed the months of the year after his various titles. He appeared in public dressed as Hercules carrying a club. He claimed to be the reincarnation of Hercules. The Senate hated him. The people thought he was insane. And his inner circle lived in constant fear, because Commodus was paranoid and executed people on a whim. By late 192 AD, several conspirators decided enough was enough. The plot included his mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Letus. The plan was to poison Commodus's wine. Marcia, who poured his drinks, added the poison. Commodus drank it and became violently ill. But he didn't die. He started vomiting, which expelled the poison. The conspirators panicked. If Commodus recovered, they were all dead. So they sent for Narcissus, an athlete and wrestler who was strong enough to overpower even the emperor. Narcissus found Commodus weak and vomiting in his bath. He wrapped his hands around the emperor's throat and strangled him to death in the bathwater. The great gladiator, the reincarnation of Hercules, the invincible warrior emperor, was killed while helpless in his bath by a wrestler hired by his own girlfriend. Commodus was 31 years old. He'd ruled for 12 years, and he died one of the most pathetic deaths imaginable for someone who prided himself on physical prowess. The conspirators immediately declared the elderly Senator Pertinax as emperor, though he lasted only 3 months before being killed himself. The year of the 5 emperors had begun, but that chaos was nothing compared to the absurdity of how Commodus died. Now we come to Emperor Domitian. who ruled from 81 to 96 AD, and whose death was caused by his own paranoia and a fake assassination list. Domitian was murdered by his own servants in 96 AD because they thought he was going to kill them, but actually, the list of people he was supposedly planning to execute was a forgery. They killed him over fake news. Domitian was the younger brother of Titus and the son of Vespasian, both respected emperors. Domitian himself started out well enough, winning military victories and building impressive structures in Rome. But as his reign went on, he became increasingly paranoid and tyrannical. He declared himself, quote, Dominus et Deus, Master and God, and demanded to be worshipped. He executed senators on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. His court lived in terror. By 96 AD, several people in his inner circle were plotting against him. The conspiracy included his chamberlain Parthenius, his secretary Stephanus, and possibly even his wife Domitia. The conspirators faced a problem, though. How do you convince someone to actually carry out the assassination when the penalty for failure is torture and death? They needed to give the would-be assassins a sense of urgency, a feeling that if they didn't act, they'd die anyway. So they forged a document, a list of names of people Domitian supposedly planned to execute. The chamberlain Parthenius showed this list to several servants, including Stephanus, and told them their names were on it. The servants, believing they were already condemned, agreed to participate in the assassination. On September 18, 96 AD, Stephanus approached Domitian with a false report of a conspiracy that needed the emperor's immediate attention. When Domitian was distracted reading the fake report, Stephanus stabbed him. Domitian fought back. He was physically strong and tried to defend himself. But the other conspirators rushed in and finished the job with multiple stab wounds. Domitian died at age 44, after ruling for 15 years. The irony is exquisite. The emperor, known for his paranoia and his practice of executing people based on suspected plots, was killed because his servants believed they were on an execution list that didn't actually exist. If Parthenius hadn't forged that document, those servants might never have worked up the courage to go through with it. Domitian was killed by his own paranoia, weaponized against him with forged evidence. The Senate, which had lived in terror of him, was so relieved by his death that they immediately declared damnatio memoriae, erasing his name from public monuments and destroying his statues. Few emperors were so thoroughly hated. Our next emperor died from the occupational hazard of being too good at angry speeches. This is Valentinian I, who ruled from 364 to 375 AD, and who literally died from yelling too hard during a diplomatic meeting. He had a stroke mid-rant and collapsed dead. He was 54 years old, and he was killed by his own rage. Valentinian I was actually a capable emperor, a military man who secured the frontiers and reformed the army. But he was also known for having a terrible temper. Ancient sources describe him as quick to anger, harsh in his judgments, and prone to explosive outbursts that terrified everyone around him. He reportedly kept 2 pet bears named Innocence and Mica Aurea that he fed condemned criminals to. His rages were legendary and frequent. In November 375 AD, Valentinian was at his camp in Brigetio, in modern-day Hungary, dealing with a diplomatic crisis. The Quadi, a Germanic tribe, had sent envoys to explain why they'd been raiding Roman territory. Their excuse was that Romans had built a fort on their land without permission. This enraged Valentinian, who saw it as impudence. During the meeting, Valentinian began shouting at the Quadi envoys. According to the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who was a contemporary, Valentinian's face turned red. Veins bulged in his neck and temples, and he began screaming at the ambassadors with such fury that he couldn't catch his breath. Suddenly, mid-rant, he stopped, gasped, and collapsed. Blood vessels in his brain had burst from the strain of his anger. He was having a massive stroke. Valentinian was carried from the meeting and died a few hours later, never regaining consciousness. The Emperor of Rome, a battle-hardened soldier who'd fought countless enemies, was killed by his own temper during a diplomatic meeting. The Quadi envoys presumably left very confused about whether they were in trouble or not. The stupidity of this death cannot be overstated. If Valentinian had just taken a deep breath, counted to 10, maybe had some wine and calmed down, he would have lived. Instead, he literally shouted himself to death. His son Gratian succeeded him, and the empire continued. But Valentinian's death became a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting your anger control you. Though I doubt many people at the time thought they might actually die from being too angry at diplomats. Now we get to Emperor Probus, who ruled from 276 to 282 AD, and who was murdered by his own soldiers because he made them do construction work during peacetime. Yes, really. The soldiers of Rome killed their emperor because he assigned them to dig a canal, and they thought that was beneath their dignity. Probus was another competent military emperor. He won victories against Germanic tribes, secured the frontiers, and brought stability to an empire that had been in chaos. He's quoted as saying that his dream was to make soldiers unnecessary, to bring such complete peace that armies would no longer be needed. Noble sentiment. Terrible judgment. The problem was that Probus believed in keeping his soldiers busy during peacetime. Idle troops caused trouble, he reasoned, so he put them to work on public projects. They drained swamps, planted vineyards, built roads, and dug canals. From a practical standpoint, this was smart. The empire got valuable infrastructure, and the soldiers stayed disciplined and fit. From the soldiers' standpoint, this was an outrage. Roman soldiers signed up to fight, conquer, and plunder. They expected glory, loot, and respect. They did not expect to be used as manual laborers digging ditches like common peasants. The troops grew increasingly resentful. Probus either didn't notice or didn't care. He kept assigning them construction projects. In 282 AD, Probus was supervising his troops as they dug a drainage canal near his hometown of Sirmium in modern-day Serbia. The soldiers' resentment finally boiled over into mutiny. They attacked Probus, who tried to flee to a nearby tower. The mutineers surrounded the tower and killed him. He was 50 years old and had ruled for 6 years. Think about this for a moment. Probus was a successful military commander. He'd won battles against Rome's enemies. He'd brought peace and prosperity. And he was murdered by his own soldiers because he asked them to dig a canal. Not because he was a tyrant. Not because he'd failed them in battle. not because he'd cut their pay, because he made them do manual labor. That's it. That's the reason. The soldiers immediately regretted it, by the way. Once their anger cooled, they realized they'd just killed a good emperor over something relatively minor. But it was too late. Probus was dead, and the empire moved on to the next emperor, who wisely did not assign his troops to any construction projects. We move now to Emperor Aurelian, who ruled from 270 to 275 AD, and whose death is remarkably similar to Domitian's, except somehow even dumber. Aurelian was assassinated in 275 AD because of a forged document. But this time, the forger was trying to save his own skin, and he accidentally got the emperor killed. It was a masterpiece of unintended consequences. Aurelian was one of the great Roman emperors, though he's not as well known today as he should be. He reunited the empire after it had split into 3 parts, earning him the title Restorer of the World. He defeated the Palmyrene Empire in the east and the Gallic Empire in the west. He built the Aurelian walls around Rome, which still stand today. He was militarily brilliant, politically astute, and exactly the kind of strong leader the empire needed in that chaotic period. But he was also strict and had a reputation for harsh discipline. His secretary, a man named Eros, knew this all too well. In 275 AD, Eros made some kind of mistake. We don't know exactly what, and he was terrified that when Aurelian found out, he'd be executed. So Eros came up with a plan to save himself. He forged a document, supposedly from Aurelian, listing names of officers who were going to be executed for various offenses. Eros showed this forged list to the officers whose names he'd written on it. These officers, believing they were condemned, panicked. They decided their only hope was to kill Aurelian before he could kill them. The conspiracy moved quickly. On the march between Byzantium and Heraclea, in modern-day Turkey, the conspirators struck. They ambushed and killed Aurelian, the emperor who had saved Rome, who had reunited the empire, who had driven back Rome's enemies on every front, was murdered by his own officers based on a forgery by a secretary, trying to avoid punishment for a minor mistake. Here's the kicker. When the truth came out, when everyone realized the death list had been fake and Aurelian had never planned to execute anyone, the officers were horrified. They'd killed the restorer of the world over a lie. Eros, the secretary who'd caused all of this, was tortured to death. But Aurelian was still dead. He was around 60 years old, had ruled for 5 years, and his murder plunged the empire back into instability, all because a scared secretary forged a document. The parallels to Domitian's death are striking, but at least Domitian was actually paranoid and did execute people regularly. Aurelian wasn't even planning to punish these officers. He was killed completely needlessly. It's one of history's tragic ironies that a great emperor's life was ended by a cowardly forgery. Now we come to what might be the most embarrassing entry on our list, the death of Emperor Pupienus. He ruled for only 99 days in 238 AD, and he was murdered while completely naked by the Praetorian Guard. Not just killed, but killed while nude, in the palace, and then his body was mutilated and thrown in the street. If there's a less dignified way for an emperor to die, I haven't heard of it. The year 238 AD was chaotic, even by Roman standards. It's called the Year of the Six Emperors. Without going into all the political complexities, the Senate appointed Pupienus and another man named Balbinus as co-emperors to rule together. This was a terrible idea. Pupienus and Balbinus hated each other. They couldn't agree on anything. They spent their entire short reign arguing and undermining each other rather than actually governing. The Praetorian Guard, meanwhile, was unhappy. They felt insulted that the Senate had appointed emperors without consulting them. Traditionally, the Praetorians had significant influence over who became emperor, and they weren't pleased about being sidelined. Tensions in Rome grew throughout the spring of 238 AD. In July, the situation exploded. The exact details are disputed by ancient sources, but here's what seems to have happened. There was some kind of festival or games in Rome. Pupienus and Balbinus attended separately because they couldn't stand to appear together. Afterward, they were in the palace, and an argument broke out between them. This argument escalated, and palace guards had to intervene. In the chaos, the Praetorian Guards saw their opportunity. They rushed the palace, overwhelmed the guards loyal to the emperors, and burst into the imperial apartments. They found Pupienus naked, either because he'd been bathing or because he'd been getting ready for bed. The sources aren't clear. What is clear is that the Praetorians grabbed both emperors, beat them, and dragged them out of the palace. Pupienus was still naked. The soldiers paraded both emperors through the streets, humiliating them, and then killed them both. Their bodies were mutilated, and they were left in the street. Pupienus's entire reign had lasted 99 days, and he died nude, beaten by his own guard, and thrown out like garbage. The Praetorians then declared Gordian III, a 13-year-old boy, as emperor, figuring they could control a child more easily than they could control adults. But Pupienus's death stands as possibly the least dignified end any Roman emperor suffered. At least the others were clothed when they died. Our next death involves Emperor Quintius, whose reign was so short and whose death so poorly documented that historians still argue about what actually happened. What we do know is that it was probably very dumb. Quintilis ruled for maybe 17 days, possibly as long as 77 days, in 270 AD. And he died either by suicide, murder, or possibly from intentional bloodletting that went wrong. Every option is somewhat ridiculous. Here's what we know for certain. After Emperor Claudius Gothicus died of plague in 270 AD, his brother Quintilis was declared emperor by the Senate and the troops stationed in Italy. However, the legions on the frontier, particularly those in the Balkans, declared their own candidate, Aurelian. Aurelian was a successful general, popular with his troops, and had no intention of yielding to Quintilis. Aurelian marched toward Rome with his army. Quintilis, realizing he was about to face a civil war he probably couldn't win, apparently decided to just die rather than fight. The ancient sources give different accounts of how this happened. Some say he committed suicide by opening his veins, a relatively common Roman method that was considered somewhat honorable. Others say his own soldiers killed him to avoid the civil war. And at least one source suggests that he asked doctors to bleed him, a medical treatment of the time, and either accidentally or intentionally bled too much and died. Whatever the exact method, Quintillus died without putting up any fight whatsoever. He had the resources of the empire at his disposal. He had armies loyal to him. He could have at least tried to defend his position. Instead, he just gave up and died, either by his own hand or by allowing himself to be killed. Aurelian became emperor without having to fight for it, and the empire moved on. The dumbness here is not in the method of death, but in the complete lack of effort Quintillus made to, be emperor. He took the position and then immediately quit in the most permanent way possible. It's like being hired for a job, showing up for the first day, deciding it's too hard, and immediately jumping out a window. Quintillus might hold the record for shortest genuine attempt at being emperor before giving up and dying. Now we turn to Emperor Florian, whose death in 276 AD proves that sometimes the best way to lose the empire is to fail to inspire any loyalty whatsoever. Florian was killed by his own troops after ruling for only 88 days, and the reason was essentially that everyone just liked the other guy better. After Emperor Tacitus died in 276 AD, his half-brother Florian seized power and declared himself emperor. He had the support of the troops in the west and seemed positioned to rule. However, the eastern legions proclaimed their own candidate, Probus, who we discussed earlier as the emperor killed for making soldiers dig canals. But at this point, Probus was just a popular general with loyal troops. Florian marched east to confront Probus, and the two armies met in Cilicia, in modern-day Turkey. But before any battle could take place, something interesting happened. Florian's troops started deserting to Probus, not because Florian had done anything particularly wrong, but just because Probus was more popular, more charismatic, and seemed like a better choice. Florian watched his army melt away. Realizing the situation was hopeless, Florian either committed suicide or was killed by his remaining troops, who figured they might as well get on the winning side. Ancient sources differ on which happened, but the result was the same. Florian died without ever really being emperor in any meaningful sense. His entire reign lasted less than 3 months, and he lost everything simply by being less popular than his rival. This death makes the list because of its pure futility. Florian didn't die heroically in battle. He didn't die in some assassination plot or civil war. He just failed to inspire enough loyalty to keep his own troops from abandoning him, and then he died as a result. It's death by being unimpressive, which is perhaps the most deflating way for an emperor to go. Moving along, we come to Emperor Gallus, who ruled from 251 to 253 AD, and was killed by his own soldiers during a march. What makes this death particularly stupid is that Gallus was murdered because his troops were retreating from a battle against a usurper, and they decided mid-retreat that they'd rather just kill Gallus and join the usurper instead. It was murder by cost-benefit analysis. Gallus became emperor after the death of Decius, and his reign was troubled from the start. The empire was under pressure from external enemies. The economy was struggling, and plague was spreading. Gallus did his best, but when things are going badly, people look for someone to blame, and the emperor is always the most convenient target. In 253 AD, a general named Aemilianus was proclaimed emperor by his troops after winning a victory against invading Goths. Aemilianus marched toward Rome. Gallus gathered his forces and marched out to meet this challenge. The two armies approached each other near Interamna in northern Italy. But as they got closer, Gallus's troops started having second thoughts. They looked at their emperor, who hadn't been particularly successful, and they looked at Aemilianus, who'd just won a victory and seemed to be on the rise. They did the math. Why fight for a losing emperor when they could switch sides and maybe get rewards from the winner? During the march, without any prompting from Aemilianus, Gallus's soldiers mutinied. They killed Gallus and his son Volusianus, who was co-emperor. They then went over to Aemilianus and declared their loyalty to him. The whole thing was bloodlessly efficient from the soldiers' perspective. They'd eliminated an emperor they didn't think could win and positioned themselves with the probable victor. The irony, of course, is that Aemilianus himself only ruled for about 3 months before being killed by his own troops in exactly the same way when yet another usurper, Valerian, appeared. The 3rd century AD was a brutal time to be a Roman emperor. Your own troops were constantly calculating whether you were worth keeping alive or whether they'd be better off with your replacement. Gallus's death is dumb because it was so casual, so transactional. He wasn't killed because of any great crime or terrible failure. He was killed because his soldiers ran the numbers and decided switching teams was the smart play. That's it. Pure pragmatism, no drama, just murder as a career move. We're near the end of our list now, and we come to Emperor Gratian, who ruled from 367 to 383 AD, and whose death proves that sometimes hosting a banquet is more dangerous than fighting a battle. Gratian was murdered in 383 AD by a usurper named Magnus Maximus while Gratian was attending a feast. He was lured to his death by an invitation to dinner. The Emperor of Rome died like a character in a murder mystery. Gratian was a capable emperor, though he made some political mistakes that hurt his popularity. He was the son of Valentinian I, the emperor who died from yelling too hard, and he seemed to have inherited his father's poor judgment in certain areas. Gratian offended the Roman Senate by preferring Christianity over traditional Roman religion, and he offended the army by favoring Alans, foreign cavalry, over native Roman troops. In 383 AD, the legions in Britain rebelled and proclaimed Magnus Maximus, the commander in Britain, as emperor. Maximus invaded Gaul with his army, and Gratian marched to confront him. The two forces met near Paris, but before any major battle could occur, Gratian's troops deserted en masse to Maximus. It was becoming a pattern in the late Empire, troops abandoning emperors for more popular rivals. Gratian, abandoned by his army, fled south with a small group of loyal followers. He was trying to reach Italy and safety. However, Maximus sent one of his commanders, a man named Androgathius, to pursue and capture Gratian. Androgathius caught up with Gratian at Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, and here's where it gets darkly comedic. Androgathius sent Gratian an invitation to a banquet, claiming to want to negotiate. Gratian, perhaps desperate for any hope of survival, accepted the invitation and went to the feast. Once there, he was seized and murdered. Some sources say he was killed at the banquet itself. Others say he was lured into a trap and killed shortly after arriving. Either way, The emperor of the Western Roman Empire was killed after falling for the oldest trick in the book, the false peace meeting. Gratian was 24 years old. He'd ruled for 16 years, having been made co-emperor as a child. And he died because he trusted an enemy's invitation to dinner. It's hard to imagine a more foolish move. Everyone knows you don't accept dinner invitations from people who are trying to kill you. That's basic survival knowledge. But Gratian, desperate and probably not thinking clearly, fell for it and paid with his life. Finally, we reach our last entry, and perhaps the most ignominious death on this entire list. This is Emperor Maximus, not to be confused with Magnus Maximus, who just killed Gratian. This Maximus ruled for a few months in 235 AD, and when he was overthrown and killed, his body was thrown into a public latrine and left to rot in sewage. I cannot stress enough how undignified this is. The Emperor of Rome, literally thrown in a toilet. Maximus, whose full name was Magnus Pupienus Maximus, was one of the co-emperors of 238 AD, that year of the 6 emperors we mentioned earlier. Actually, I may have conflated some details earlier. Let me be clear. This is complicated history with a lot of people with similar names. What matters is that Maximus was an emperor for a very short time. He was killed, and his body was disposed of in the most disrespectful way imaginable. When the Praetorian Guard killed him during their rampage through the palace, they didn't just leave his body lying around. They specifically took it and threw it into the public latrines, the sewers. This wasn't just murder. This was a deliberate statement of contempt. They were treating the emperor like literal garbage, like human waste. The symbolism here is hard to overstate. In Roman culture, proper burial was extremely important. The treatment of a body after death reflected the person's honor and status in life. To deny someone proper burial was the ultimate insult. To not just deny burial, but to actually throw the body into a sewer was to say that the person was worth less than excrement. And this wasn't some random murdered citizen. This was the Emperor of Rome, theoretically the most important person in the world, chosen by the gods, master of the known world. And he ended up floating in a sewer with the contents of thousands of Roman toilets. It's almost impossible to imagine a more complete destruction of imperial dignity. The Praetorian Guard's message was clear. They didn't just reject this emperor, they utterly despised him and wanted everyone to know it. Maximus's body eventually was presumably recovered and buried. But the image of an emperor's corpse bobbing in sewage is hard to shake. Now we move to our next story in this video. We've just seen how Roman emperors died in the most ridiculous ways imaginable, from poisoned mushrooms to toilet assassinations. But their deaths weren't the only absurd things about them. Many of these emperors also fought wars that were so pointless, so poorly planned, or so completely insane that you have to wonder what they were thinking. Tonight, we're going to explore the dumbest military campaigns in Roman imperial history. The wars that never should have been fought, the battles that were lost before they began, and the military disasters that happened because an emperor's ego was bigger than their brain. We're talking about wars declared on the ocean itself, invasions that turned into massacres, campaigns launched for the dumbest possible reasons, military disasters caused by sheer incompetence. These were the rulers of the most powerful military machine the ancient world had ever seen, commanding the legendary Roman legions. And they used that power in the most baffling ways possible. So settle in as we examine 15 of the absolute dumbest wars Roman emperors ever fought. Some of these campaigns cost thousands of lives. Some bankrupted the treasury, some weakened the empire permanently, and all of them were completely, utterly, magnificently stupid. Let's begin. We start with perhaps the most famous stupid war in Roman history, Emperor Caligula's war against the sea. Yes, you heard that correctly. In 40 AD, Emperor Caligula declared war on Neptune, the god of the sea, and ordered his legions to attack the ocean. This actually happened. Multiple ancient historians recorded it. And it might be the single dumbest military campaign in human history. Caligula ruled from 37 to 41 AD, and by 40 AD, he was clearly losing his mind. He'd started his reign reasonably well, but illness, power, and possibly lead poisoning from the water pipes in the palace had driven him into increasingly bizarre behavior. He declared himself a living god. He appointed his horse Incitatus as a priest and allegedly planned to make the horse a consul. He would have conversations with statues of Jupiter. The man was unhinged. In 40 AD, Caligula decided to launch a military campaign across the English Channel to invade Britain. This was actually a reasonable idea. Julius Caesar had invaded Britain nearly a century earlier, and conquering the island would bring glory to Caligula's name. He gathered legions on the northern coast of Gaul, assembled a fleet, and prepared for the invasion. The soldiers were ready, the ships were ready, everything was in place. And then Caligula apparently just changed his mind, or lost his mind entirely, or both. According to the historian Suetonius, Caligula suddenly ordered his troops to draw their weapons and attack the sea. He commanded them to stab the waves with their swords and throw their javelins into the water. The legionaries, who were trained to fight barbarians and conquer nations, stood on the beach stabbing the ocean like it had personally offended them. But it gets better. After the soldiers had finished their assault on the sea, Caligula declared victory. He announced that he had conquered Neptune and defeated the ocean in glorious combat. He then ordered his troops to collect seashells as spoils of war. That's right. The mighty Roman legions, veterans of countless battles, were ordered to gather seashells like children on a beach trip. These seashells were then brought back to Rome and displayed as trophies of Caligula's great naval victory. The soldiers were given a triumph, the traditional Roman celebration for military victory, but instead of displaying captured enemy weapons and prisoners, they displayed seashells. Caligula rode through Rome in his chariot, celebrating his conquest of the ocean. The Senate was forced to vote him honors for this great victory. The Roman people watched this parade and presumably wondered what had happened to their empire. The cost of this campaign was enormous. Moving legions, assembling fleets, maintaining armies in the field. All of this required massive expenditure from the treasury, and the result was a beach full of confused soldiers and a bunch of seashells. No territory was conquered. No enemies were defeated. No strategic objectives were achieved. Just seashells and the complete destruction of any remaining credibility Caligula had. The soldiers hated him after this. You can imagine the conversations in the camps. These were professional warriors who'd signed up to fight and conquer. Instead, they'd been ordered to attack the ocean and collect shells. Their emperor had made them look like fools. It's not surprising that Caligula was assassinated less than a year later by his own Praetorian Guard. You can only push the military so far before they decide you need to go. Historians still debate what actually happened. Some think Caligula was genuinely insane and really did order an attack on the ocean. Others think it might have been a bizarre punishment for his troops, who may have shown reluctance to cross the channel. Some speculate he was mocking the Senate or making some kind of satirical point. But whatever his reasoning, the result was the same. Caligula wasted enormous resources on a campaign against the literal ocean, and his legacy was forever tainted by the image of Roman soldiers stabbing waves and collecting seashells. It's hard to top declaring war on the sea, but our next entry involves Emperor Nero, who fought a war against himself, or more specifically, against Greek statues he thought were judging him. In 67 AD, Nero went to Greece for an extended tour, and while there, he declared war on the Olympic Games and various works of art. This was not a metaphorical war. Nero actually fought them. Nero is famous for many terrible things. He allegedly fiddled while Rome burned, though that's probably historical myth. He murdered his mother. He married a boy he'd had castrated because the boy resembled his dead wife. He was a terrible emperor. But his Greek tour might be his most absurd moment. Nero fancied himself an artist. He thought he was a brilliant musician, actor, and poet. In reality, he was mediocre at best, but no one dared tell the emperor he had no talent. So Nero lived in a bubble where everyone praised his performances. In 67 AD, he decided to go to Greece and compete in the Olympic Games and other athletic festivals. Because apparently conquering nations wasn't enough, he needed to win sporting events too. The problem was that Nero was not athletic. He was overweight, out of shape, and completely unskilled at any sport. But he entered competitions anyway. He competed in chariot racing despite having no experience. In one famous race, he fell out of his chariot and didn't even finish. But he was still declared the winner because he was the emperor and the judges valued their lives. He competed in singing competitions and won every single one, despite being tone deaf. He competed in acting competitions and was awarded first prize before he even performed. But here's where it gets weird. Nero became convinced that the statues of previous Olympic victors were mocking him. He would walk past these bronze statues of ancient Greek athletes, and he'd interpret their poses as insulting or dismissive of his victories. So he ordered many of these statues destroyed or melted down. He declared war on works of art that had stood for centuries, just because he thought they were judging him. He also banned certain Olympic events because he couldn't compete in them. If Nero couldn't win an event, he simply eliminated it from the games. The ancient Olympic tradition, which had been running for nearly 800 years, was altered because one emperor's ego couldn't handle competition he might lose. The Greek tour lasted over a year and cost Rome dearly. While Nero was in Greece playing athlete and warrior against statues, the empire was neglecting real problems. There were uprisings in Gaul and Judea. The economy was struggling, the legions were restless. But Nero was too busy winning rigged competitions and fighting bronze statues to care. When Nero finally returned to Rome, he celebrated his victories with a grand triumph. He displayed all the crowns and prizes he'd won in Greece, over 800 of them according to ancient sources. But everyone knew the truth. These weren't real victories. They were participation trophies from a rigged game. The Senate pretended to be impressed. The people of Rome watched the spectacle and wondered how much longer they'd have to endure this madness. Less than a year later, in 68 AD, multiple legions rebelled against Nero. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state. Nero fled Rome and committed suicide, with his famous last words being, "What an artist dies in me." Even at the end, he was delusional about his talents. His war against Greek statues had accomplished nothing except making him look ridiculous and wasting enormous amounts of time and money while the empire crumbled around him. Now we move to Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, who is generally remembered as one of the good ones. But even Marcus Aurelius fought a remarkably stupid war. Or rather, he trusted his son Commodus to continue a war in the dumbest way possible. This is the story of how the Marcomannic Wars, which should have expanded Rome's borders permanently, instead became a pointless waste because Commodus wanted to go home and play gladiator. Marcus Aurelius spent most of his reign from 161 to 180 AD fighting Germanic tribes along the northern frontier. These wars, known as the Marcomannic Wars, were brutal and difficult. Thousands died. The plague swept through the armies. But Marcus was slowly winning. By 180 AD, he had pushed the Germanic tribes back and was preparing to permanently conquer the territory across the Danube River, which would have given Rome a more defensible northern border. This was sound military strategy. The Danube frontier was always vulnerable to raids. By conquering the territory beyond it and establishing new provinces, Marcus would have secured Rome's northern borders for generations. He had the troops, he had the momentum. He was on the verge of a major strategic victory. And then he died. In 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius died of illness while on campaign. His son Commodus, who we discussed earlier as the emperor strangled in his bath, became emperor. And Commodus immediately decided that he'd had enough of boring frontier wars. He wanted to go back to Rome and live the good life. So he did the dumbest thing possible. He threw away everything his father had achieved. Commodus negotiated a peace treaty with the Germanic tribes that essentially reset everything to how it was before the wars began. He didn't demand unconditional surrender. He didn't establish the new provinces his father had planned. He just signed a treaty that maintained the status quo and then left for Rome with the legions. All those years of fighting, all those thousands of deaths, all that expenditure of treasure, it was all for nothing. Marcus Aurelius's grand strategic vision died with him. Back in Rome, Commodus had more important things to do, like dressing up as Hercules and fighting in the arena. He fought as a gladiator hundreds of times, always against opponents who were forbidden from hurting him. He killed animals and staged hunts. He renamed Rome after himself. He did everything except actually govern the empire or care about frontier security. The Germanic tribes, seeing that Rome had abandoned the conquered territory, immediately resumed raiding across the Danube. The frontier was just as vulnerable as before, maybe more so, because now the tribes knew that Roman emperors might just give up and go home if they got bored. The Marcomannic Wars had accomplished nothing except killing a lot of people and wasting a lot of money. Later emperors would have to fight the same Germanic tribes again and again, refighting the same wars that Marcus Aurelius had almost won. The northern frontier remained Rome's constant problem, and much of that can be traced back to Commodus's decision to abandon his father's strategy because he wanted to play dress-up in Rome. It's one of history's great what-ifs. If Marcus Aurelius had lived another few years, if Commodus had not been such a terrible emperor, Rome might have permanently secured its northern border and avoided centuries of conflict. But that's not what happened. Instead, we got Commodus fighting in the arena while barbarians raided across the frontier. The war wasn't lost on the battlefield. It was lost because one emperor couldn't be bothered to finish what his father started. That's a special kind of military stupidity, the kind where you're winning and you just decide to stop because you're bored. Now we turn to Emperor Caracalla again, who we met earlier dying while urinating on the roadside. But before his embarrassing death, Caracalla fought one of the dumbest wars in Roman history, a war of conquest that began with him murdering all the witnesses to his crimes. In 215 AD, Caracalla massacred thousands of people in Alexandria, Egypt, and then had to fight a war to cover up the massacre. It's circular logic at its finest. Caracalla arrived in Alexandria in 215 AD during a tour of the eastern provinces. Alexandria was one of the empire's great cities, wealthy, culturally sophisticated, and known for its philosophers, scientists, and artists. But Alexandria also had a reputation for mockery. The Alexandrians were famous for their sharp wit and their willingness to ridicule even emperors. They'd written satirical poems and songs mocking Caracalla, particularly about the murder of his brother Geta, which was a sensitive subject for the emperor. Caracalla, who had inherited his father Septimius Severus's paranoia along with the throne, decided that Alexandria needed to be taught a lesson. He invited the city's young men to a festival, supposedly to honor them and show he bore no grudges. Thousands of young Alexandrians gathered in the city's gymnasium and stadium, excited for the celebration. Once they were assembled, Caracalla sprung his trap. He ordered his troops to surround the venues and massacre everyone inside. The slaughter was horrific. Thousands of young men were killed in a matter of hours. The soldiers then spread through the city, killing anyone who looked like they might have been involved in the mockery or who might have witnessed the massacre. Bodies piled up in the streets. The city that had been full of life became a charnel house. Ancient sources say the Nile River ran red with blood, though that's probably an exaggeration, but it conveys the scale of the atrocity. But here's where Caracalla's plan fell apart. You can't secretly massacre thousands of people in one of the empire's largest cities. Word spread. Other cities heard what happened. The Senate in Rome learned about it. And while no one was going to directly challenge Caracalla because he was a brutal tyrant who killed people on suspicion alone, the massacre in Alexandria made him look like a monster, even by Roman standards. So Caracalla decided he needed a distraction. He needed a military victory to change the narrative, to make people remember him as a conqueror rather than as a mass murderer. He decided to invade Parthia, Rome's great eastern rival. This was not a strategic war. Parthia hadn't attacked Rome. There was no particular reason to invade at this moment. Caracalla just needed a war to make himself look good. In 216 AD, Caracalla invaded Parthia with a large army. But he didn't really have a plan beyond invade and see what happens. He crossed into Parthian territory, burned some villages, won a few minor skirmishes, and then declared victory and went home. It wasn't a real conquest. He hadn't captured any major cities or defeated the Parthian army in a decisive battle. He just raided across the border and left. The Parthians, understandably angry about being invaded for no reason, began preparing for war. They mobilized their armies and prepared to strike back. Caracalla had started a war that Rome would have to continue fighting long after he was dead. And remember, he started this war not for strategic reasons, not to defend Rome, but to distract people from the massacre he'd committed in Alexandria. Caracalla died in 217 AD, murdered while urinating, as we discussed earlier, before the Parthian War really escalated. His successor Macrinus had to deal with the mess. In 217 AD, the Parthians invaded Roman territory and won a significant victory at the Battle of Nisibis. Macrinus was forced to pay a massive indemnity to buy peace, essentially paying the Parthians to stop the war that Caracalla had started for no good reason. So let's recap Caracalla's strategic thinking. He murdered thousands of people in Alexandria to punish them for mocking him. Then he started a war with Parthia to distract from the massacre. The war achieved nothing and led to Rome being defeated and having to pay reparations. Thousands more died in the Parthian fighting, all because Caracalla couldn't handle being made fun of and needed a PR victory. It's difficult to imagine a dumber chain of military decisions. Now we come to one of the most catastrophic military disasters in Roman history. And it happened because Emperor Valens refused to wait for reinforcements. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD wasn't just a defeat. It was the beginning of the end for the Western Roman Empire. And it happened because one emperor's ego made him rush into battle he wasn't ready for. Valens had been emperor in the East since 364 AD, co-ruling with his brother Valentinian I in the West. By 378 AD, Rome was facing a crisis. The Goths, a Germanic people, had been pushed into Roman territory by the Huns from the East. Normally, Rome would have integrated them peacefully, but there were hundreds of thousands of Gothic refugees, and the Roman officials tasked with managing them were corrupt and abusive. The Goths, starving and mistreated, rebelled. Valens gathered an army and marched to deal with the Gothic uprising. Meanwhile, his nephew Gratian, who'd succeeded Valentinian I in the West, was also marching east with his army to help. The plan was for the two emperors to combine their forces and overwhelm the Goths with superior numbers. This was sound strategy. The Romans would have had a significant numerical advantage. But Valens's scouts reported that the Gothic army ahead of him was smaller than expected, maybe only 10,000 warriors. In reality, the scouts had only spotted part of the Gothic force. The main Gothic cavalry was out foraging and wasn't visible, but Valens didn't know this. He saw an opportunity for a quick, glorious victory that would be his alone, not shared with his nephew. Valens's generals advised him to wait for Gratian. His officers counseled caution. Even some of his commanders begged him to wait. But Valens was jealous of Gratian, who'd won several recent victories and was gaining prestige. Valens wanted a victory of his own. He wanted the glory. He wanted to prove he was the superior general. So on August 9, 378 AD, despite all advice to the contrary, Valens ordered his army to attack. The Battle of Adrianople was a disaster. The Romans attacked the Gothic wagon ford, and initially things went reasonably well. But then the Gothic cavalry, thousands of mounted warriors who Valens didn't know existed, returned from their foraging and slammed into the Roman flanks. The Roman army, tired from a long march in summer heat and now surrounded, began to collapse. What followed was one of the worst military defeats in Roman history. The Gothic cavalry swept through the Roman lines. Roman soldiers, weighted down by armor and exhausted, couldn't flee fast enough. They were cut down by the thousands. The battlefield became a killing ground. Bodies piled up so thickly that the Goths had to climb over corpses to reach new victims. Valens himself was killed in the battle, though accounts differ on exactly how. Some say he died fighting in the melee. Others say he was wounded and carried to a farmhouse, which the Goths then burned, killing everyone inside, including the emperor. Either way, Valens died in a disaster of his own making. Of the 30,000 Roman soldiers who fought that day, perhaps 20,000 were killed. 2/3 of the army was destroyed. Multiple legions ceased to exist. The master of infantry and over 30 tribunes died. The Battle of Adrianople is often considered the beginning of Rome's final decline. The military loss was catastrophic, but the psychological impact was worse. Romans had always believed their legions were invincible, that barbarian warriors could never defeat organized Roman infantry. Adrianople proved that belief wrong. The Gothic cavalry had shattered Rome's finest troops. And it all happened because Valens couldn't wait a few days for reinforcements. If he'd waited for Gratian, if he'd combined their armies as planned, Rome would have likely won a decisive victory. The Goths might have been crushed, and the empire's borders secured for another generation. Instead, Valens's impatience, his jealousy, his need for personal glory led to one of history's most consequential military disasters. The Goths, emboldened by their victory, continued to rampage through Roman territory. Later emperors had to settle them inside the empire, giving them land and autonomy. This set a precedent for other barbarian groups, who realized Rome could be defeated and extracted. The Western Roman Empire would fall less than a century later, and you can draw a direct line from the Battle of Adrianople to that final collapse. All because one emperor couldn't handle waiting for his nephew's army to arrive. Now we turn to Emperor Septimius Severus, a generally capable military leader who nonetheless fought one of the most pointless and expensive wars in Roman history. In 208 AD, Severus invaded Scotland. Yes, Scotland. He spent enormous resources trying to conquer a land of wet rocks and angry highlanders, achieved absolutely nothing, and died there. It's hard to think of a less productive use of military force. Septimius Severus had been emperor since 193 AD, and by 208, he was getting old. He'd fought civil wars to secure his power, campaigned on the eastern frontier, and generally solidified his position. But he wasn't content to retire peacefully. He wanted one more grand military campaign, one more conquest to cement his legacy. So he decided to invade Caledonia, as the Romans called Scotland. This was dumb for several reasons. First, Scotland had no significant wealth. It wasn't like Egypt or Gaul, which had cities, agriculture, and resources worth conquering. Scotland was mostly highlands, harsh terrain with scattered settlements of fierce warriors who had nothing worth taking. Second, Hadrian had already built his wall across northern Britain specifically to mark the limit of Roman territory, essentially saying, "This far and no further." Severus's campaign was ignoring a previous emperor's strategic assessment. Third, Scotland had been tried before. Emperor Antoninus Pius had built his own wall further north in the 140s AD, and it had been abandoned as indefensible within 20 years. Everyone knew Scotland was more trouble than it was worth, but Severus was determined. In 208 AD, he arrived in Britain with his sons Caracalla and Geta, massive military forces, and plans to conquer everything north of Hadrian's Wall. The campaigns were brutal. The Caledonians refused to fight pitched battles. Instead, they used guerrilla tactics, ambushing Roman patrols, poisoning water supplies, and disappearing into the highlands. The Romans won the few battles that did happen, but they couldn't pin down the enemy for a decisive victory. Ancient sources describe the conditions as nightmarish. The terrain was boggy and difficult. Supplies were hard to maintain. Disease ravaged the troops. The locals were hostile and impossible to subdue. Severus reportedly said, "Let no one escape, not even the child in the womb," ordering a policy of total extermination. But even genocide isn't easy when the enemy won't stand still to be slaughtered. The campaign dragged on for 3 years. Severus aged rapidly under the strain. His health deteriorated, and by 211 AD, it was clear the campaign was going nowhere. Rome controlled the lowlands, but the highlands remained unconquerable. The Caledonians were still fighting, and the cost in blood and treasure was staggering. In February 211 AD, Septimius Severus died in York, England, without ever conquering Scotland. He was 65 years old. His last words were reportedly, "I have been everything, and it is worth nothing." That's a remarkably depressing epitaph for an emperor who'd achieved so much but ended his life failing to conquer a land that offered nothing worth having. His sons Caracalla and Geta immediately abandoned the campaign, made peace with the Caledonians, and returned to Rome where they could scheme against each other. All the fighting, all the deaths, all the expense, it was for nothing. Scotland remained unconquered. Hadrian's Wall remained the frontier. Nothing had changed, except thousands were dead and the treasury was depleted. Severus's Scottish campaign stands as a testament to the folly of fighting wars for legacy rather than strategy. Scotland offered Rome nothing, Conquering it would have been a drain on resources with no benefit. But Severus wanted one more triumph, one more conquest to add to his list. So he spent 3 years and died trying to conquer a land that literally every previous emperor had written off as not worth the effort. That's a special kind of military stupidity, the kind where everyone knows better but the emperor does it anyway. Now we move to Emperor Diocletian, who was actually one of the more competent emperors. But even Diocletian had his moments of military stupidity, and his persecution of Christians could be considered a war against his own population that weakened the empire from within. From 303 to 311 AD, Diocletian and his successors fought the Great Persecution, an attempted genocide that accomplished nothing except making Christians more determined and damaging Rome's internal cohesion. By 303 AD, Christianity had been growing in the Roman Empire for centuries. Christians were everywhere, from slaves to senators, from soldiers to courtiers. Many were loyal Romans who simply worshipped differently from the traditional Roman gods. But Diocletian, influenced by his Caesar Galerius, decided that Christianity was a threat to traditional Roman values and needed to be eliminated. The Great Persecution began with edicts ordering the destruction of Christian churches and scriptures. Then it escalated to arresting Christian clergy. Then it went further, demanding that all Christians sacrifice to Roman gods or face execution. The goal was to force Christians to renounce their faith or die. This wasn't a war against a foreign enemy. This was Rome fighting its own people. The persecution was brutal and widespread. Churches were burned. Scriptures were destroyed. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in various creative and horrible ways. Some were thrown to wild animals in the arena. Some were burned alive. Some were crucified. The accounts of martyrdoms from this period are horrific. And yet, the persecution failed completely. Here's why it was militarily stupid. First, you can't kill an idea. Diocletian was trying to eliminate a religion through force. But religious beliefs don't die just because you kill believers. In fact, persecution often strengthens religious movements. Christians saw martyrdom as a path to heaven, so killing them just created more devoted believers. Every public execution was free propaganda for Christianity. Second, Christians were everywhere in the empire, including in the military and the government. By persecuting them, Diocletian was attacking people who might otherwise be loyal servants of Rome. He was creating enemies where none had existed. He was forcing people to choose between their faith and their empire, and many chose faith. Third, the persecution was expensive and distracting. Resources and attention that should have been focused on defending the frontiers and managing the economy were instead devoted to hunting down Christians. It was a war that consumed energy without achieving anything productive. The persecution eventually ended in 311 AD when Galerius, dying of a horrible disease that he saw as divine punishment, issued an edict of toleration. Christians were allowed to worship freely again. 2 years later, Emperor Constantine would convert to Christianity and make it the favored religion of the empire. Within a century, Christianity would be the dominant religion and paganism would be suppressed. Diocletian's attempt to eliminate Christianity through persecution had failed utterly. All it accomplished was creating thousands of martyrs, hardening Christian resolve and wasting years of effort on an unwinnable war. You can conquer territories. You can defeat armies. But you can't conquer belief through force. Diocletian, for all his administrative genius, failed to understand this simple truth. His war against Christianity was a strategic disaster that weakened the empire and accomplished nothing except giving Christians a compelling narrative of persecution and triumph. Now we move to Emperor Julian, known as Julian the Apostate, who fought a catastrophic campaign against Persia in 363 AD that ended with his death and a humiliating Roman defeat. Julian was trying to equal Alexander the Great. Instead, he led Rome into one of its most disastrous eastern campaigns. And he did it against all advice because he thought the gods were on his side. Julian became emperor in 361 AD after a period of civil wars and palace intrigue. He was unusual among emperors of his time because he'd rejected Christianity and tried to restore traditional Roman paganism. He fancied himself a philosopher emperor, a warrior sage who would restore Rome's ancient glory. And he decided the best way to do this was to launch a grand invasion of Persia. The Persian invasion made some strategic sense. Persia was Rome's longtime rival, and a decisive victory could secure the eastern frontier for generations. But Julian's planning was dangerously overconfident. He believed the gods were guiding him to victory. He believed that by restoring pagan worship, he'd earned divine favor. He saw himself as a second Alexander the Great, destined to conquer the East. In March 363 AD, Julian crossed into Persian territory with a huge army, perhaps 65,000 to 83,000 troops. He advanced rapidly, winning several minor victories and besieging cities. But he made a critical error. He burned the fleet that was supposed to supply his army via the Euphrates River. Julian's reasoning was that this would force his troops to fight with no retreat possible, that they'd be more motivated if they couldn't fall back. It's the kind of dramatic gesture that works in legends, but is suicidal in real warfare. Without the fleet, Julian's army had to forage for supplies in enemy territory. The Persians used scorched earth tactics, burning crops and poisoning wells. The Roman army, huge and requiring enormous amounts of food and water, began to struggle. They marched deeper into Persia, winning battles but failing to decisively defeat the Persian army, which kept retreating and refusing to commit to a pitched battle. By June, Julian realized he was in trouble. He was deep in Persian territory with no supplies. The Persian army was harassing him constantly, and his own troops were starting to fall apart. He decided to retreat, but the Persians pursued, attacking constantly. The Roman army was exhausted, hungry, and demoralized. On June 26, 363 AD, during a Persian attack, Julian rushed into battle without putting on his armor properly, supposedly because he was in a hurry. In the fighting, he was struck by a spear. Some sources say it was a Persian spear. Others claim it was actually a Christian soldier in his own army, taking advantage of the chaos to kill the emperor who'd persecuted their religion. Either way, Julian was mortally wounded. He died in his tent that night, his grand Persian conquest a complete failure. He was 31 years old and had ruled for less than 2 years. Julian's successor Jovian immediately negotiated a peace treaty with Persia, and the terms were humiliating. Rome had to give up territories, including cities that Rome had held for centuries. The Roman army limped back across the border, defeated not primarily by Persian military might, but by Julian's overconfidence and terrible strategic planning. Julian's Persian campaign is a classic example of what happens when an emperor starts believing his own propaganda. He thought he was divinely favored. He thought he was the new Alexander. He thought his genius would overcome all obstacles. Instead, he led Rome's army to disaster, got himself killed, and handed Persia a victory that they'd barely had to fight for. It was a war that never should have been fought, certainly not in the way Julian fought it, and it weakened Rome's eastern position for decades afterward. Now we turn to a series of civil wars that were arguably the dumbest military conflicts Rome ever faced, because they were Romans fighting Romans over which Romans should rule Romans. The crisis of the 3rd century, particularly the wars between 235 and 284 AD, saw the empire nearly collapse as generals fought each other, while barbarians raided unchecked and the economy imploded. It was 50 years of Romans killing Romans while the empire burned. The crisis began when Emperor Severus Alexander was murdered by his own troops in 235 AD. What followed was chaos. In the next 50 years, Rome had at least 26 different emperors, most lasting only a year or two before being killed or overthrown. At one point, the empire split into 3 parts: the Roman Empire proper, the Gallic Empire in the west, and the Palmyrene Empire in the east. Romans were fighting Romans in multiple civil wars simultaneously. Let me give you a sense of how dumb this was. In 238 AD, the year of the 6 emperors, 6 different men claimed the title of emperor within a single year. They fought each other, formed temporary alliances, betrayed each other, and died in rapid succession. Meanwhile, Germanic tribes were raiding across the Rhine and Danube, Persians were invading in the east, and the economy was collapsing because everyone was too busy fighting civil wars to collect taxes or maintain order. Emperor Gallienus, who ruled from 253 to 268 AD, spent most of his reign fighting other Romans who wanted to be emperor. He never had time to secure the frontiers or fix the economy because he was constantly fighting usurpers. At various points, he was simultaneously dealing with rebellions in Gaul, Germanic invasions, plague, economic collapse, and assassination attempts. He managed to hold the empire together somewhat, which was an impressive achievement given the circumstances. But he was eventually assassinated by his own officers in 268 AD. The worst part of the 3rd century crisis was that it was entirely self-inflicted. There was no external enemy forcing this chaos. No barbarian invasion had broken Roman military power. No plague had wiped out the population. Romans were destroying Rome because individual generals decided they'd rather be emperor than serve the existing emperor. Each civil war weakened the empire further, killed more trained soldiers, diverted resources from the frontiers, and encouraged barbarians to raid more aggressively. Historians estimate that during the 3rd century crisis, the Roman population declined by as much as 25 to 30% in some regions. Parts of the empire were effectively abandoned. Cities shrank behind new fortification walls, trade routes collapsed, The currency was debased so much it became nearly worthless. And why? Because Roman generals couldn't stop fighting each other long enough to actually govern or defend the empire. The crisis was finally ended by Emperor Diocletian, who we mentioned earlier, when he seized power in 284 AD and implemented massive reforms. But the damage was done. Rome never fully recovered its former strength. The Western Empire would fall less than 2 centuries later. And much of the blame for that fall can be traced back to 50 years of Romans fighting the dumbest war possible. War against themselves. Think about the sheer stupidity of it. The empire faced real external threats. Germanic tribes, Persians, economic problems, plague. But instead of uniting to face these challenges, Romans killed each other over who got to wear the purple. Every civil war meant trained legionaries killing trained legionaries, soldiers Rome desperately needed for frontier defense. Every usurper who seized a province meant tax revenue lost to the central government. Every year spent fighting internal enemies was a year the barbarians grew bolder. The 3rd century crisis is perhaps the ultimate example of imperial military stupidity because it wasn't one emperor's bad decision. It was 50 years of many emperors and generals all making the same bad decision, choosing personal ambition over the empire's survival. They fought civil wars they should have avoided, spent resources they couldn't afford, and weakened Rome at the exact moment when it needed to be strong. It's collective insanity on a spectacular scale. Now we come to Emperor Honorius, who presided over the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the early 5th century, and whose military incompetence was so profound that it's almost difficult to believe. Honorius didn't just lose battles. He seemed fundamentally incapable of understanding that Rome was in existential danger. His response to crisis after crisis was to do nothing, and sometimes to actively make things worse. Honorius became Western Emperor in 395 AD, when he was just 10 years old. His father, Theodosius I, had split the empire between Honorius in the west and his brother Arcadius in the east. Honorius was completely unfit to rule. He was more interested in raising chickens than governing. He lived in Ravenna, protected by marshes, while the empire collapsed around him. In 410 AD, something happened that hadn't occurred in 800 years. Rome was sacked. The Visigothic king Alaric had been trying to negotiate with Honorius for years, asking for land to settle his people and recognition as an ally of Rome. Alaric was actually reasonable. He didn't want to destroy Rome. He just wanted to find a place for his people within the empire. But Honorius refused every offer, rejected every compromise, and generally acted like Alaric was beneath his notice. So Alaric marched on Rome, besieged the city, and when negotiations still failed, he sacked it. For 3 days, the Visigoths looted the Eternal City. It was a psychological blow to the entire Roman world. Rome, the city that had once conquered the Mediterranean, that had stood invincible for centuries, had fallen to barbarians. And it happened because Honorius couldn't be bothered to negotiate a reasonable settlement with Alaric. Here's the famous story about Honorius's reaction to hearing Rome has fallen. When a messenger rushed to Ravenna with the news, Honorius was apparently very upset. But it turned out he thought they meant his favorite chicken, which he'd named Rome. When he learned they meant the actual city of Rome, he was reportedly relieved. This story might be exaggerated or invented by later historians, but it captured the truth about Honorius. He was more concerned with his chickens than with governing. But it gets worse. After the sack of Rome, Honorius still refused to settle the Visigoths. He still refused to make peace. He still refused to acknowledge that Rome's military situation was desperate. The Visigoths eventually carved out their own kingdom in southern Gaul and Spain. Other barbarian groups saw Rome's weakness and invaded. Britain was abandoned, the province simply left to fend for itself. Gaul was overrun. Spain was divided among various Germanic tribes. And through it all, Honorius sat in Ravenna with his chickens, doing nothing. The military stupidity here is passive rather than active. Honorius didn't fight disastrous campaigns like Valens or Julian. He just failed to fight at all. He had a general, Stilicho, who was actually competent and might have saved the Western Empire. But Honorius was convinced by courtiers that Stilicho was plotting against him. So Honorius had Stilicho executed in 408 AD. He killed the one man who might have saved the empire because of paranoid accusations. Honorius ruled until 423 AD, a reign of 28 years during which the Western Empire fell apart piece by piece. And the emperor's response to each crisis was inaction, denial, or counterproductive interference. When he died, the empire was a shadow of what it had been. Most of the western provinces were effectively independent or under barbarian control. The military was a joke. The economy had collapsed. And all of this happened on Honorius's watch, while he bred chickens and ignored reality. Honorius's reign is a masterclass in how not to respond to military crisis. When your empire is being invaded, when Rome itself is under threat, when everything you're supposed to protect is falling apart, you don't get to ignore it because you're more interested in poultry. But that's exactly what Honorius did, and the Western Roman Empire paid the price. Our next entry involves Emperor Justinian I, who ruled the Eastern Roman Empire from 527 to 565 AD. Now, Justinian is often remembered as a great emperor who reconquered much of the Western Empire and codified Roman law. But his wars of reconquest were actually catastrophic wastes of resources that weakened the Eastern Empire and accomplished nothing permanent. They're great examples of wars fought for prestige rather than practical benefit. By the 530s, the Western Roman Empire had fallen. Italy was ruled by the Ostrogoths. North Africa was ruled by the Vandals. Spain was Visigothic. Gaul was Frankish. The Roman Empire had shrunk to just the eastern half, what we call the Byzantine Empire. Justinian couldn't accept this. He dreamed of restoring the empire to its former glory, of reconquering all the lost territories. So he launched massive military campaigns to do exactly that. From 533 to 554 AD, Justinian's armies fought brutal wars across the Mediterranean. They reconquered North Africa from the Vandals. They reconquered Italy from the Ostrogoths. They even took part of southern Spain from the Visigoths. On paper, these were great victories. Justinian had restored much of the old empire's territory, but the cost was staggering, and the gains were ultimately meaningless. The Gothic War in Italy lasted nearly 20 years, from 535 to 554 AD. It devastated the Italian peninsula. Cities were besieged, sacked, and depopulated. The countryside was ravaged, the population plummeted. Rome itself changed hands multiple times and was nearly destroyed. By the time Justinian's general Narses finally defeated the last Gothic resistance, Italy was a wasteland. The province that had once been the heart of the empire was now impoverished and broken. And for what? Italy was broke. It couldn't pay for its own defense or contribute taxes to Constantinople. Justinian had spent enormous treasure to conquer a province that was now worthless. Worse, the long war had depleted the empire's military resources. The armies that had conquered Italy couldn't be used to defend the empire's eastern frontiers against the Persians, who took advantage of the distraction to invade Roman territory in the east. North Africa was a similar story. It was reconquered quickly, but holding it proved expensive. The local Berber tribes resisted Roman rule. The province required constant military presence. And like Italy, it couldn't generate enough tax revenue to pay for its own defense. Justinian had conquered territories that were drains on the empire rather than assets. The ultimate stupidity of Justinian's reconquests became clear just a few decades after his death. In 568 AD, just 3 years after Justinian died, the Lombards invaded Italy. They conquered most of the peninsula, and the Byzantines were too weak to stop them. All of Justinian's hard-won Italian conquests were lost within a generation. The long, bloody, expensive wars had accomplished nothing permanent. North Africa fared a bit better, staying under Byzantine control longer, but it too was eventually lost, conquered by the Arabs in the 7th century. Spain was lost almost immediately. By 700 AD, all of Justinian's western reconquests had been lost again. The empire had spent its strength on wars of vanity that produced no lasting benefit. Justinian's wars are dumb because they were fought for the wrong reasons. He wasn't defending the empire or securing critical resources. He was trying to recreate the past, to restore a version of Rome that no longer existed and couldn't be sustained. He bankrupted the treasury, exhausted the military, and left the empire weaker than before. Also, he could claim he'd restored Roman glory, even though that glory was an illusion that lasted barely longer than his lifetime. A truly smart emperor would have recognized that the Western Empire was gone and focused on strengthening what remained. Justinian could have used those resources to fortify the eastern frontier, reform the economy, and build a sustainable Byzantine empire. Instead, he chased dreams of past greatness and left his successors to deal with the consequences of his vanity. Now we turn to one of the most bizarre military expeditions in Roman history. Emperor Heliogabalus's plan to conquer Armenia because he was bored. We met Heliogabalus earlier when he was murdered on a toilet, but before that embarrassing end, he planned military campaigns that made no sense whatsoever. He wanted to fight wars as entertainment, like playing a video game, except real soldiers would die for his amusement. Heliogabalus ruled from 218 to 222 AD, and he was 14 years old when he became emperor. He had no interest in actually governing and every interest in scandalous behavior that offended Roman sensibilities. But he also had this strange fascination with playing war. He would dress up in military costume, ride around on horses, and pretend to be a great general. He wanted real wars to command, not because Rome needed them, but because he thought it would be fun. In 220 AD, Heliogabalus announced plans to invade Armenia. There was no strategic reason for this. Armenia was a buffer state between Rome and Persia, sometimes allied with Rome, sometimes with Persia, but generally not worth invading. It was mountainous, difficult terrain with fierce local fighters. Previous emperors had learned that controlling Armenia directly was more trouble than it was worth. But Heliogabalus wanted a war, and Armenia was conveniently located. The Senate and military commanders tried to talk him out of it. They explained that an Armenian campaign would be expensive, difficult, and strategically pointless. Armenia wasn't threatening Rome. Invading it would anger Persia and possibly start a larger war. There was literally no benefit to this campaign. But Heliogabalus didn't care about strategy or consequences. He wanted to play general and have a war to command. Fortunately for everyone, the campaign never actually happened. Heliogabalus's grandmother, Julia Maesa, who was the real power behind the throne, managed to delay and obstruct the plans. She knew that if Heliogabalus actually led troops into the field, it would be a disaster. The soldiers already hated him for his bizarre behavior and religious policies. If he started getting them killed in a pointless war, they'd mutiny immediately. The Armenian campaign was eventually canceled, supposedly postponed indefinitely. But really, everyone just hoped Heliogabalus would forget about it or get distracted by something else. And he did get distracted by his multiple marriages, his religious ceremonies, his cross-dressing, and the various other behaviors that made him enemies throughout the empire. In 222 AD, he was murdered by the Praetorian Guard, and his cousin Alexander Severus became emperor. The Armenian War that never happened was forgotten. This entry is on our list not because of what actually occurred, but because of what almost occurred. Heliogabalus nearly launched a major military campaign for no reason except that he was bored and wanted to play general. That's perhaps the dumbest possible reason to start a war. At least other emperors on our list had some kind of rationale, even if flawed. Caligula was insane. Nero was delusional. Caracalla wanted to distract from his crimes. But Heliogabalus just wanted entertainment. He saw war as a game, a form of personal amusement, with no consideration for the soldiers who would die or the empire that would bear the cost. It's actually fortunate he was such a terrible emperor in other ways, because his awfulness in domestic policy prevented him from causing military disasters. If he'd been slightly more competent or likable, he might have actually led armies into battle, and the results would have been catastrophic. Sometimes incompetence prevents even greater stupidity. We're nearing the end of our list, and we come to Emperor Phocas, who ruled from 602 to 610 AD, and whose military incompetence was so complete that he almost lost the entire Eastern Roman Empire. Phocas didn't fight one dumb war. He fought all his wars stupidly, simultaneously, while alienating everyone who might have helped him. It's a masterclass in how to destroy an empire through sheer incompetence. Phocas came to power through a military mutiny in 602 AD. He wasn't a nobleman or a skilled general. He was a centurion who happened to be in the right place when the army rebelled against Emperor Maurice. The soldiers proclaimed Phocas emperor, and he seized Constantinople and executed Maurice and his family. It was a brutal coup, and Phocas was a brutal emperor. His reign was a disaster from day one. He had no administrative experience. He made terrible appointments. He alienated the Senate, the church, and the people of Constantinople through his violence and paranoia. But his military record was even worse. When the Persians invaded in 603 AD, claiming to be avenging Maurice's murder, Phocas had no idea how to respond. He appointed incompetent generals based on personal loyalty rather than skill. He refused to go to the front himself, and he generally acted like the Persian invasion was someone else's problem. The Persians advanced virtually unopposed. They conquered Syria, including the crucial cities of Damascus and Jerusalem. They took Egypt, cutting off Constantinople's grain supply. They invaded Anatolia and reached the shores of the Bosporus, right across from Constantinople itself. The empire was collapsing, and Phocas seemed unable to comprehend the danger. He spent more time executing people he suspected of disloyalty than actually fighting the Persians. Meanwhile, the Avars and Slavs were invading the Balkans from the north. Cities were sacked, populations were enslaved or massacred. The Danube frontier, which had been stable for centuries, collapsed completely. And again, Phocas's response was inadequate. He sent whatever troops he could spare, which wasn't many because most of the army was either fighting Persians or refusing to fight for an emperor they hated. By 609 AD, the empire was in mortal danger. The Persians controlled most of the eastern provinces. The Balkans were overrun. The treasury was empty. The people were starving because Egypt's grain wasn't arriving. And Phocas was still more concerned with hunting down imagined conspirators than with actually governing or defending the empire. In 610 AD, Heraclius, the son of the governor of North Africa, launched a revolt. He sailed to Constantinople with a fleet, was welcomed by the population as a liberator, and overthrew Phocas. Phocas was captured, tortured, and executed. His reign had lasted 8 years, and in that time he'd nearly destroyed the empire through incompetence. Heraclius spent the next 20 years fighting to undo the damage Phocas had caused. He eventually defeated the Persians and recovered the lost provinces, but the effort exhausted the empire. And then the Arabs emerged, conquering those same provinces permanently. The Eastern Roman Empire survived, but it was permanently weakened. And much of that weakness can be traced to Phocas's catastrophic military leadership. Phocas makes our list because he fought every war wrong. He appointed bad generals. He ignored military advice. He focused on internal enemies while external enemies conquered his provinces. He wasted resources on paranoia while the army starved for supplies. He turned potential allies into enemies through his brutality. In short, he did everything possible to ensure military defeat, and he succeeded spectacularly. If there's a manual on how not to conduct warfare, Phocas wrote it. Finally, we come to our last entry, and it's a perfect encapsulation of Roman military stupidity. Emperor Gordian III's campaign against Persia in 242 to 244 AD, which ended with the emperor possibly being murdered by his own praetorian prefect. who then surrendered to the Persians and paid them a huge bribe to let the Roman army retreat. Its betrayal, incompetence, and humiliation all rolled into one catastrophic campaign. Gordian III became emperor in 238 AD when he was only 13 years old. He was the youngest person ever to become Roman emperor, and he was essentially a puppet for various powerful figures who manipulated him. By 242 AD, when he was 17, Gordian decided to lead a campaign against the Persian Empire, which had been raiding Roman territories. The campaign started well enough. Gordian, or rather his generals acting in his name, won several victories. Roman forces drove the Persians back and recaptured lost territories. There was even a significant victory at the Battle of Ravenna in 243 AD. For a moment, it looked like Rome might achieve a decisive victory over its eastern rival. But then things went wrong. The Praetorian prefect, a man named Philip the Arab, was essentially running the campaign since Gordian was young and inexperienced. Philip had ambitions of his own. He wanted to be emperor, and Gordian was in his way. In 244 AD, the Roman army was deep in Mesopotamia, far from home, and supplies were becoming a problem. The Persians were using their usual tactics of retreating and harassing the Roman forces rather than committing to pitched battle. In February 244 AD, Gordian III died. The circumstances are murky. Official sources claim he died in battle against the Persians, but many historians believe Philip had him murdered. Either way, Philip immediately declared himself emperor and made peace with the Persians. And the terms of that peace were humiliating. Philip paid the Persians 500,000 denarii to let the Roman army retreat safely. Think about that. The Roman army, which had been winning battles and advancing, suddenly paid the enemy to let them leave. Philip essentially surrendered and bribed the Persians to not pursue. He abandoned recently captured territories. He gave up Rome's strategic gains. And he did it all to secure his own position as emperor. The Roman troops were furious. They'd fought hard, won battles, and died for this campaign. And their reward was to pay the enemy and retreat like defeated cowards. But they couldn't do anything about it. Philip controlled the Praetorian Guard, and opposition meant death. So the army retreated, paid off the Persians, and returned to the empire in disgrace. Philip's peace with Persia was a strategic disaster. It emboldened the Persians, who now knew that Rome could be bribed and intimidated. It demoralized the Roman military, and it set a precedent for future emperors buying peace rather than winning it. The campaign that had started as a potential triumph ended as a humiliating retreat, all because one man's ambition led him to betray the empire and its army. Gordian III's Persian campaign perfectly encapsulates so many themes we've discussed. Military operations undermined by internal politics. Strategic victories thrown away for personal gain. Roman forces fighting each other instead of the enemy. An empire weakened not by external defeat, but by internal betrayal. It's a fitting end to our list of the dumbest wars Roman emperors ever fought. And so we've reached the end of our journey through Roman military stupidity. We've seen emperors declare war on the ocean and collect seashells as spoils. We've seen them fight statues and abandon winning campaigns out of boredom. We've seen them rush into battle out of jealousy and die as a result. We've seen them invade Scotland for no good reason and persecute their own people while enemies invaded. We've seen 50 years of civil war that nearly destroyed the empire. We've seen emperors ignore barbarian invasions while raising chickens. We've seen reconquests that bankrupted the empire for no lasting gain. And we've seen betrayal and incompetence lead to humiliation in the field. These weren't just bad luck or unavoidable disasters. These were choices. These emperors chose to fight these wars. They chose to ignore advice. They chose personal glory over strategic wisdom. They chose ego over empire. And Rome paid the price in blood, treasure, and ultimately survival. The lesson here is clear. It doesn't matter how powerful your military is if your leadership is incompetent. Rome had the greatest army in the ancient world, the legendary legions that conquered from Britain to Mesopotamia. But that army couldn't save Rome from its own emperors. When your commander-in-chief is declaring war on the sea, or abandoning campaigns to play gladiator, or rushing into battles out of jealousy, even the best soldiers can't save you from defeat. And perhaps that's the real tragedy of these dumb wars. It wasn't that Rome lacked military strength or strategic capability. It's that the system of imperial rule created incentives for bad military decisions. Emperors needed glory to maintain legitimacy. They needed victories to keep the army loyal. They needed to project strength, even when strategic withdrawal made more sense. This created a situation where emperors fought wars they shouldn't have fought in ways they shouldn't have fought them, for reasons that had nothing to do with Rome's actual security needs. The Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD. The Eastern Empire lasted another 1,000 years, but was forever weakened by centuries of bad military decisions. And while we can't blame every problem on bad emperors, we can certainly trace many of Rome's military disasters to the specific choices made by specific rulers, who should have known better but chose glory, ego, or personal ambition over the empire's welfare. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think about these emperors and their dumb wars. Think about Caligula fighting the ocean. Think about Valens rushing into battle and destroying his army. Think about Phocas watching the empire collapse while he hunted conspirators. Think about all the soldiers who died in these pointless campaigns, who fought and bled and gave their lives for nothing because their emperor was incompetent or insane or just didn't care. History is full of these stories, of great powers weakened by bad leadership, of mighty armies defeated by their own commanders. Foolishness. Rome wasn't unique in this. But Rome's story is particularly tragic because the empire lasted so long and accomplished so much despite its terrible leaders. Imagine what Rome might have achieved if its emperors had been even moderately competent. Imagine how much longer it might have lasted if it hadn't wasted so much strength on stupid wars. But that's not what happened. Instead, we got centuries of military incompetence, punctuated by brief moments of strategic brilliance. We got emperors who thought fighting the ocean made sense. We got wars started for ego and abandoned for boredom. We got an empire that conquered the world and then slowly destroyed itself through sheer stupidity. And with that sobering thought, we close this chapter of Roman history. The dumbest wars ever fought by the most powerful empire in the ancient world. Wars that should never have happened, that accomplished nothing, that weakened Rome at the exact moments it needed to be strong. Wars fought by emperors who were more concerned with personal glory than the empire's survival. Sleep well tonight, friends. Sleep peacefully in your beds, grateful that you don't live in an age where emperors can declare war on the ocean, or invade Scotland for no reason, or abandon winning campaigns because they're bored. Be thankful for modern systems of government that at least tried to prevent such catastrophic decision-making. Be grateful that you don't have to fight and die in wars started by madmen and incompetence. And as you drift off to sleep, remember these stories. Remember the dumbest wars Roman emperors ever fought. Remember the soldiers who died for nothing. Remember the empire that fell because its leaders couldn't stop making terrible decisions. Let these stories be a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of competent leadership. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Roman military incompetence. Thank you for listening to these tales of stupidity and tragedy. And thank you for being part of this community that loves history, even the absurd and awful parts of it. Good night, everyone. Sleep well, rest easy, and may your dreams be free of emperors declaring war on oceans and collecting seashells as victory spoils. Until next time, take care of yourselves, appreciate the peace and stability you have, and remember the lessons of history. The past has much to teach us if we're willing to listen. Sweet dreams, friends. May you sleep soundly through the night, warm and safe, far from the madness of ancient Rome and its catastrophically stupid wars. Good night, and sleep well.